I'm going to try to speak for around 15 to 20 minutes. Unfortunately, I have to teach here at 2 o'clock in New York, so I'm here only virtually. I'd much rather be in my home state of California with you thinking about this material. What I think Millard Sheets, when I started working on a project about the art and architecture of Millard Sheets, people constantly asked about, isn't Sheets a painter, right? Isn't he somebody known for his watercolors? Where does the architecture fit into this? On the other hand, people do know the home savings buildings, even if they don't really understand how many of them there are or exactly how they fit into the larger set of projects that Sheets worked on. So what I want to do right now is give you a sense of some of the variety of projects that Sheets worked on in architecture. He was never a licensed architect, but he engaged with architects throughout his 2/3 at least of his career, and did a lot of very interesting work that also has traditional mid-century modern sort of scholarship has resisted thinking too much about. Architecture scholarship in general thinks a lot about residential work. Almost all this work is commercial. Again, he wasn't trained as an architect. He wasn't in these conversations with architects outside of his practice. What you're looking at here is Van Ness branch in San Francisco. We'll come back to that. Here is one of the earliest moments where Sheets talks about really engaging in an architectural project. Through business connections, he met somebody who was engaged with the U.S. Army's air group. There wasn't an Air Force yet. And they had a sense that they needed more flight schools before Pearl Harbor, before what became World War II. And so they very quickly built a number of air schools all through the West, a lot in California, Arizona, Northern and Southern California. A lot of them have names like Thunderbird and Cal Aero. A lot of the buildings are completely gone in places like Ontario that went on to be larger airports. But there are some of these buildings that still exist. Sheets also wanted to make sure that he had furniture and design that he felt that humanized the spaces, not just that they were built quickly and they were a good place to train pilots, but that they really could be a space where people could have the full experience of art and architecture, as you can see in this image on the wall of the dining room. He also helped design the chairs so that he felt that they would survive and not get broken by the anxious, the youthful pilots and their desire to roughhouse. This is the first building that Sheets designed for Howard Arenson. His story is that he got a call out of the blue, but he had in fact worked on a building for Pacific Clay Products downtown. It was written up in the LA Times. Howard Arenson, his wife, and Millard Sheets' wife had been sorority sisters, so they had some knowledge of each other. And he took him out to lunch, and he said he wanted to get together and look at these materials for new buildings. He didn't really explain what he wanted. And then he said, come back with a sketch for this property. And Sheets created this image for what was known as the National American Fire Insurance Building. It was at Serrano in Wilshire. It was torn down to build the Arenson Center later. But you get a sense of some of Sheets' design elements in this initial sketch, right? You can see the palm trees, which have their role in a lot of the architecture of this period, horizontal lines, the contrast of indoor-outdoor, light and dark, sculptural elements. That's a mosaic over the door, framing of the door very dramatically on the corner. Here's a look at what the building looked like, a black and white image from when it was constructed. You can see that tree in the back, and Sheets talked about how he wanted a building to look already old when he started, right? So some of the mid-century modern work is very self-consciously cutting edge, space age, atomic age, trying to look different. Sheets wanted to work in traditional materials, things like mosaics, gold, ceramic tiles, stained glass, and he brought in very large old trees, right, which was expensive, and he wanted to make it look like it had always been there. You can see it has a fortress sort of element. It's not facing the street. It's sort of using it almost like a billboard to speak to the street, but to keep the entrances for the employees in the back People would go into these doors, almost like a cathedral, a small door into a large building, and then often the big spaces inside were meant to wow them as well. The early work for home savings normally engaged family themes, but some of the work for other savings and loans, like Pomona First Federal, engaged the question of the local history and how should people's experience be linked to that history. Eventually, this became a so popular theme that he began to do it for home savings as well, in these kinds of origins to now images that began often with Native Americans and then Spanish, Mexican, Gold Rush era, and often ended in the Victorian era. Sort of almost just beyond lived memory to give people a sense of this rootedness. Some of the works went up to the present, but they generally stopped in the past. This is a very extensive one that hopefully you'll get a chance to go see in what's now the Amoka building. Sheets had done all this while he was working at Scripps. Sort of his secretary, who had a chance to interview, Mary Dane Winker, talked about how she was supposed to be doing this and running the arts department and sort of keeping track of Sheets as he moved around the world. Eventually, Sheets then goes to Otis and then resigns these jobs to work full-time on these commissions and builds the studio buildings, one of which you see here up on Indian Hill Road, as a space to bring together these artists and think about these issues. You're looking at the mural projection room and the Mosaic room. The building behind where you see a wall in the back there was the building where the architects and Sheets' own offices were. This is the Compton branch. There was the home savings and loan very quickly became the largest savings and loan in Los Angeles and in the nation. They were able to take advantage of some loopholes in the way their license was to expand slightly beyond where other people were. But there was an effort to be both of the community and to have an image that was instantly recognizable, the point that you could drive by at 30 miles an hour and find a home savings. Similarly, before I had a good list, I was actually sort of able to intuit, like get off the freeway here, this looks like the main exit for Burbank. If I go up, one or two streets, I'll find a main street and Main Street, and that'll be the location. So I write about the ways in which they chose locations, the kinds of buildings they wanted to build in those locations on a corner with parking behind it. They wanted most people to come in the back, but they wanted some people to be able to walk in the front. They wanted these entrances that were sort of marked in a big way, like you can see here. You can see the drama of the black and white, and those tiles again would shine in gold when it was constructed, using some of the same glass and steel, black and white that we see in a lot of modernist work, but for a very different purpose, right? To sort of speak of rootedness. Some of the critics thought they looked like mortuaries or mausoleums, maybe like an ancient sarcophagus, but they said this was good. I mean, the Sheets, they often took offense at this, but the critics saying it said it helped people think about keeping their money and their money lasting beyond them, the way a pyramid was about to keeping things forward. Very intricate artwork. Here's Sue Laubman-Hertel, who you heard about in the documentary, working on some of the early full-color sketches. Eventually, they were able to build this work in Mosaic in the offices. Before that, they went and sent some work to the Ravenna Mosaic Company of St. Louis, who was also involved with lots of Art Deco projects, from Rockefeller Center to the Guardian Building in Detroit. And then eventually they began to do this work in Claremont. Part of my study looks at, this is the Burbank branch, about they were on these corners, but they were in neighborhoods that were changing. I mean, Arenson was very much a visionary about where he thought there would be tall buildings in the future. They build in Glendale, I'll show you in a minute, a tower long before the freeway is completed, and hence long before there's a corridor of towers there. You can see their neighbors could be auto dealerships, they could be department stores. Some places that already had some natural foot traffic, but home savings was about the tract developments that were going to develop around these small town main streets, and home wanted to be that first landmark, that thing you saw when you got off the freeway in Encino, even before the freeways reached all of these places. Here's the Masonic Temple, also on Wilshire. Really, a sense of what Sheets could do, both when he wasn't in the home saving style that became slightly more ossified, but also with a larger space, more money. But you can see the concept of those corners that were rounded out, that the cornice being different and the very flat lines. Here you have kind of finial on top there, but still the use of emblems, of mosaic work and sculpture work to give it a sense of conversation, continuity with things like cathedrals and classical architecture was an important part of how Sheets approached architecture. He often said that he cared about representational work, he cared about design principles, and that he cared about what the patron wanted, right? So he wasn't out to shock the patrons, he wasn't out to do something radical because he felt its moment had come. He wanted to express what he thought the patron wanted to see in their values, which led to a more conservative style. The Pomona Pedestrian Mall project was a labor of love for him, having grown up in Pomona, an integration again of commercial spaces, art and architecture, not only in the tower and the Bullocks building, but in the fountains and the various work alongside. I don't know if you'll be able to see my pointer, but that's Sheets on the far left, followed by Howard Arenson, and a number of Pomona officials, and then Arthur and Jean Ames, who were really the people who had the mosaic skills at Scripps and taught all the people who became mosaicists in the studio. Apparently not a very good picture of the Garrison Theater, but another example of the work that Sheets did with his architects, right? He was never the architect of record. He worked with S. David Underwood. He worked with B.H. Anderson. He eventually worked with a number of structural engineers and Frank Homolka out of Long Beach. But they were often given sketches. I mean, he had sketches that he wanted them to say, figure out a way to make this in architecture that will stand up and the pipes will all work and all that sort of stuff. He cared very much about all the elements of the design. Here's a chance to look at the original branch in Beverly Hills and then the Studio City branch. You can see it's basically the same building. The Studio City branch has been turned to kind of go across on a diagonal of the corner, creating a plaza space. It also has a larger parking lot that way in the back. And you can see these are later with the Chase ownership and the gold tiles being removed from the one down below. But you know, he felt at times that the style was frozen by Amundsen, that he wasn't really able to create new opportunities. But Amundsen felt this building is working, why do we want to create new opportunities? You can see that there's the way in which the light's coming down over the statues on the edges there, creating certain patterns of light and dark, another modernist theme that I think we see a lot of in California, using the sunlight and the palm trees as part of the architecture. This is the entranceway to the Sunset and Vine, the Hollywood branch, very intricate mosaic. There was a time capsule that had been on this site. It had been an Art Deco building or a modern building for NBC Radio. It was torn down, and then this building was put up. Some architecture people are still angry about that. It happened in 1968. But it gives you a sense of how there was a chance to expand some of these things, but the style for Home Savings was often very frozen. This is another Pomona First Federal building near you in Claremont. You can see the lotus columns, a larger set of patios. We can think of them, a different kind of design, still in the same vocabulary, but different because not for Home Savings. Here's another one where the same basic design that you had seen in Studio City and Beverly Hills. Here, the side arms of the building are angled around the plaza to create a slightly different shape and embrace it a little more. Those gold tiles that had been vertical are replaced by slit windows where the gold tiles remain at the top. Again, working within what became a sort of ossified Home Savings style that Sheets took credit for, but also said was really a collaborative work, both with the architects and artists in the office and with the people at Home Savings. And that I'm writing about that interplay between commercial leadership in the sense of this is the biggest S&L in the country and an artist's vision towards architecture. Here's one of those towers. I think this is Glendale, but the ones in Laguna and West Covina are very similar. When other buildings may have been tall and ostentatious and using neon, Sheets built these very traditional two-story buildings. In places where there were not yet towers, Home Savings started to build larger commercial office towers using lights, using neon as a way to stand out. And again, some of those same designs, in some ways it's like a large version of those smaller buildings, But I think it still has a little bit of the attitude. You can see in the Pomona version, for example, that those window shades say H, S, and L on it. Here they're just simple lines going up and down the building. I think this is one of the really exquisite examples. This is after Howard Arenson has died. There's slightly more variety in the work that gets done. You see you have these 3D mosaic work being integrated with the sculptures. You also have one like that in Lakewood. Out in front, you have the same use of that dark black granite, along with a very intricate mosaic of horses over a slightly larger door. The use of the 3D shields and the way in which the tiles are now have another color in there. But again, those same lines, the travertine, the dark and the light, the use of the sky, it's in a very prominent position. Sort of you come up around the top of a hill, and there you find this very exquisite branch. In Northern California, they had challenges where they ran into zoning people who felt, we don't want flop architecture. We don't want your two-story gold cornice building in our neighborhood. It doesn't match. This is what you do everywhere. Why should we allow it? So there's a challenge in the question of sort of franchising an architectural idea versus asking for new work for your community. On the left, that's Mountain View, where they asked for brick, and so they got something like the old home savings design, but now done in red brick with some large archways. They did archways in San Diego right about the same time. This is like 76 to 79. Meanwhile, Walnut Creek rejected the original small plan. Then they approved that building on top of the San Francisco Savings brutalist structure. Home Savings went back and said, wait a minute, how are they allowed to build that? We're not allowed to build large. They ended up getting what's a very anonymous looking Homolka designed regional center that you can see down there in the corner. But it was clearly a moment where the resistance to Home Savings just coming in and doing what they wanted began to change the designs. I have a few examples of later innovations and a few challenges that I want to highlight and give you a few minutes for questions before I run off to class. This is an ATM structure built in '82 at the Pomona First Federal in Claremont, echoing the design. Sheets had retired, but Dennis O'Connor and Sue Hertel continued the work are creating this. Here you see in Highland Park that the mosaic was cut by the ATM's shield by the sun. It's in the Chase color, but I'm not sure if it was done by Chase or by Washington Mutual. But there have been a lot of issues with preserving this work recently. Here in Encino, when the branch was redesigned, the vault mosaic, which goes back to the late 50s, you can see a refrigerator there in the lockers. It's not on public display anymore. And there are those trees that I had on my first slide. Someone who's passionate about this work is actually trying to get those trees chopped down in front of the branch in San Francisco because they're on city property, they haven't been trimmed, and so you can't see those mosaics at all. They're just hiding behind those trees at this point. This is a mural inside a branch in San Francisco that got painted over. And this is a mosaic that was painted over in Long Beach. So it's still there. It's still over the door. It's sort of a two-story building at the bottom of a larger tower. But it was painted over. The tenants after Home Savings was sold to Washington Mutual in '98, and then Washington Mutual was seized by the federal government in '08, '09. And so there's been uncertainty. That's what brought me to this project. And I feel there are a lot of issues around the question of, is this work being recognized? Do people know who worked on them? Do they have a sense of these buildings, and can they be preserved in this crucial period for them? I think that's probably my last slide. I'll stay on and hopefully get your questions. I'll use my headset if we have a problem with the feedback. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. So I'm ready to, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Hopefully you could hear me before.
Yes.
I could hear you when I spoke, but not otherwise, but it was a mess. So I don't know if John could type any questions. Okay, so the question about the corners and the location. So hopefully you can hear me right now. Yeah. So that was the work of Home Savings. I mean, Home Savings came with the lots, and they said, this is where we want things. They spoke about the concept of being at Main and Main, of being at these prominent corners. They were planning meetings that Sheets was in the 70s, and you see them plotting for certain lots. Like they try to buy gas stations, and they want to make sure that they're in these prominent places, and they don't go to certain communities unless they can get those prominent places. I probably have time for one or two more. Are any mosaics now protected as historic landmarks? So speaking of the Sheets ones, there have been a variety of moments where the Sheets work has been recognized by various groups, by LA Beautiful, by the Conservancy, sometimes by the city. For example, Beverly Hills, they took a mosaic that used to be at the Beverly Wilshire. With the help of the Arenson Foundation, they were able to reinstall it on the Civic Center garage, and they wrote up a whole report about the 9245, the original building in Wilshire, another building at 9145, and saying that they wanted to make these local landmarks. And I'm not sure where that process stands. I know that you'll hear more about Montebello a little later. The Santa Monica, similarly, there's been a discussion about the building at 26 in Wilshire, whether it would be landmark, for example, because another Home Savings in Santa Monica was torn down. There are a lot, there are these mosaics, some of them, like for example, there's one in Irvine that was a ceramic tile mosaic the Ameses did. It was displayed at the fair. It's now sitting in San Juan Capistrano, sort of near a fountain. I think because of the time period and because this work some of it is very spread out. There are 4 in the whole state of Missouri, 1 in Ferguson, 1 in Springfield. People don't realize that they're part of a larger story. And part of what I'm trying to do in my book is to say that this is a larger story. It's basically one art commission that begins in 1955, and it goes all the way through 1992. And I think we think of it as a body of work the way we think of, say, the Best Products buildings, or some of the other kind of commercial work. Interpace did do the ceramic tiles. It was Gladding McBean first, and then it was Interpace. The mosaics were almost all glass smalty, but the mosaic tile work, going back even, there's a Bob's Big Boy that Sheets did for Underwood in Phoenix. That work is all being done ceramic tile locally in California. They wrote about my research in the New York Times, and there's a question of where he did a 4 elements version for Interpace's headquarters in New Jersey, and we don't know where it is. It seems that Time Life probably packed it up, and nobody knows what happened to it. Unfortunately, I have to go teach about Columbus right now at 2 o'clock. So it was great to be part of this a little bit, and I'm happy to take questions on my website and hopefully see people in February in Palm Springs or elsewhere. Thank you.